This is now video number 11 of Chapter 2 in the Brotherhood of Darkness by Dr. Stanley Monteith. It is impossible to understand what is happening today without understanding the origin of the protocols. While going through Colonel Edward Mandell House's papers at Yale University some years ago, I came across a copy of the protocols of the meeting of the Zionist Men of Wisdom. It was essentially the same document as the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, but the wording was different, which suggested it was a different translation of the original document. The protocols were written in French, smuggled into Russia in 1905, where they were translated into Russian and later transported to Great Britain, where Victor Marsden translated them into English. Copies of Victor Marsden's translation are available in the United States today, but the translation is entirely different from the Colonel House version, which suggests that Colonel House's version came from another source, perhaps from the original document. Who was Colonel House and where did he get his copy of the protocols? Was he an anti-Semite? Colonel House was able to control the men who led the world between 1912 and 1938 because he had the ability to ooze thoughts into their minds. Arthur Howden Smith knew him and commented on his mystical ability. Colonel House would come into an office and say a few words quietly, and after he had gone, you would suddenly become seized by a good idea. You would suggest that idea to your friends or superiors and be congratulated for it. It would work first rate, beyond your wildest dreams. You might forget about it, but sometime, as sure as shooting, in cogitating proudly over it, you would come to an abrupt realization that the idea had been oozed into your mind by Colonel House in the course of conversation. Smith then described Colonel House's account of his third meeting with Woodrow Wilson. It was an evening several weeks later, when he had been paying me a visit, that I said to Mr. Wilson as he rose to go, "Governor, isn't it strange that two men who never knew each other before should think so much alike?" He answered, "My dear fellow, we have known each other all our lives." By their third meeting, Woodrow Wilson was under Colonel House's control. House was well aware of his ability to control others. I found an entry in his unpublished diary where he bragged about how he convinced Premier Clemenceau of France and Premier Orlando of Italy of something he knew wasn't true. In January 1919, both men feared that the Bolsheviks intended to foment revolutions in their countries, and they wanted to send a military contingent to Russia to defeat the Bolsheviks. Colonel House wrote, "I had a heart-to-heart talk with Clemenceau about Bolshevism in Russia and its westward march. I made him confess that military intervention was impossible. Later in the afternoon, when Orlando called, I gave him very much the same kind of talk, and he too agreed with my conclusions. I am trying, and have partially succeeded, to frighten not only the President, but the English, French, and Italians regarding what might be termed the Russian peril. Personally, I really do not believe there is as much danger as I make it to them. I would not confess that military intervention was an impossibility, because I believe that it could be successfully accomplished if gone about properly. A voluntary and a mercenary army of very small proportions, equipped with artillery and tanks, would, in my opinion, do the work." Here Colonel House admits that he made both Clemenceau and Orlando confess that the use of military force against the Bolsheviks would be futile, yet he knew that wasn't true. This is an example of how Colonel House was able to ooze ideas into the minds of the leaders of the Western world. Why did Colonel House want to protect the Bolsheviks? James W. Gerard was the American ambassador to Germany during World War I. In his book, My First 83 Years in America, he related another story about Colonel House. Representatives of the German government contacted Ambassador Gerard in February 1915 and asked him to notify President Wilson that they wanted to stop the war. The ambassador sent President Wilson a cable, but Colonel House replied and told him that henceforth all communications with President Wilson were to be sent through him. Ambassador Gerard wrote, "In addition to the cable which I had already received, informing me that Colonel House was fully commissioned to act, he himself reminded me of my duty in his February 16 postscript. In his own handwriting were those words from House: 'The President has just repeated to me your cablegram to him, and says he has asked you to communicate directly with me in the future. All authority, therefore, has been vested in Colonel House, and as I was directed to report to Colonel House direct, the President ceased to even be a conduit of communications.'" Ambassador Gerard commented on the power Colonel House had assumed. He who had never been appointed to any position and who had never been passed upon the Senate was fully instructed and commissioned to act in the most grave situation. I have never ceased to wonder how he had managed to attain such power and influence. Colonel House controlled President Woodrow Wilson, and the President did his bidding. Later, Colonel House controlled President Roosevelt, and much of the social legislation enacted during the Roosevelt administration involved programs that Colonel House advocated. Where did Colonel House get his ability to control people's minds? I will answer that question later. Before I go on, I must clarify the source of the funds used to finance the Russian revolutions. It is impossible to understand what is happening today without an understanding of who was responsible for the first and second Russian revolutions. When Cecil John Rhodes died, he left his fortune to the Rhodes Trust. Lord Alfred Milner assumed control over that trust and of Rhodes' secret society. Although he was never elected to public office, Lord Milner held many important government posts. During the first 2.5 years of World War I, his agents held key positions in the British government, and when Lloyd George became Prime Minister, Milner's men took control of England. Lloyd George recruited a staff to help him govern. 4 of the 6 members of his secretariat were members of the Round Table, which was a front organization for the secret society that Lord Milner led. On February 24, 1917, The Nation published an article discussing Lloyd George's secretariat, a little body of Illuminati whose residence is in the Prime Minister's garden and their business to cultivate the Prime Minister's mind. These gentlemen stand in no sense for a civil service cabinet. They are rather of the class of traveling empirics in empire, who came in with Lord Milner and whose spiritual home is fixed somewhere between Balliol and Heidelberg. And we will stop it right there and pick up in the next video. And let's see how much we have left of this chapter. It's going to take, it's probably going to take 2 or 3 more videos. So hang with me, we'll get there.